Es war das Zusammenkommen verbunden mit den Jahrzeit noch den Taten und kemedubur kam Pomim, was Afal Pi, was Licheiro, in das Alinien von Aproti, wie bald aber Bichlal Asiden kleiden sich zusammen, wird es schön Alinien Kloli, ist ätzend Sach, wo das Rätsel wegen der Jahrzeit von Aiden, was hat sich Messer Nefesh gewähnt, al-Haklal, und das ist gewähnt, die Derech HaTeva, die Siba, von sein nicht-ariches Yomim, Lifierach. Der Fall, was mit Zadavidose Bishvil Haklal, hat man früher reingesetzt, bemeistert, in Arrest und danach verschickt und dort Gufe gemattert, wo das gewähnt, der Levushim bei Derech HaTeva, was der Fall gewähnt, nicht kein ariches Yomim, wie es hat gedacht sein bei Derech HaTeva. Jetzt auch das Gufe, Madgish, hat das Ayin, was scheich ist zu Aklau, und befragt noch, aber wie bald das Miset, hat die Peris von seinem Messias Nefesh bei Medina Hahi, einen haben gebracht, Peris und Peris, das heißt bei Pashtus, Iden, wo sie seinen Leben die Teile, wie Schemere Mitzvah, Bechaye jem, nicht gucken dich auf dem Matzel, wie sie gewähren dorten, bei Zman Hahu, und nachher dann noch in die Jahren Liacherise, wo das ist der Chechet Abir, auf der Linie von der Jahrzeit, wo die Gemorre sagt sich, la Haloche, als es beschaße da, an die Zies, an der Schomme beguf, das Bedugne von der Sreife, von der Sefer Teiro, wird sich die Scheile sich adover wie Fuche, a Yid mit Magid Dvorev Liankev, Chukov und Mishpotev Yisro, was jeder lost aus der Ebersteller soll sein, der Sefer Teiro, Shenisrefo. Das a Hepech a Halocho, do fun Gufe verstandig, a der Pikuach Nefesh, was wird durch Ruf aufgetan, der Aliyah Achig Delo, was durch Ruf, was wird durch Ruf herauskommen, Ezeche Deche, a viel Asamin Inyan, Achim Avil, wo das bringt noch zu Praven a Jorzeit. Wo das Ezeche Tabir ve Hezber, a Bishas do a Tag von a Jorzeit, Alachas kamen von a Gordel bi Yisro, Alachas kamen von a Sami, was hat sich Messer Nefesh gewähnt, al-Haklal, und hat angenommen, sein Messias Nefesh, bis Messias Nefesh bepeil, kleis an Neshama mehaguf. A das ist nicht mehr Maid, und die Piulese, was getan in Afotzes Ayadus, der Adrabe, wie bald die Piulis, kommt dazu noch zu, der Sipur und der Hero, was mit ihm hat getroffen, bis Seif Yomov, Schlebe Derech HaTeva, als gewähnt der Kiddush Hashem bepeil, Messias Nefesh, Yitzis HaNefesh min Aguf, ist das noch mehr Mechazik, die Piula von seinen Piula ist bepashtus, in Afotzes Ayadus, bei die alle, was gepeil dämmelt, und nechet bei die, was peilt ist, durch seine Sforim, was haben sich auch gedruckt, und wir lernen sie, kommt dazu zu, midi Shono beshono, lernt man sich noch in seine Sforim, kommt zu noch in Piulis, und die Tezois von seinen Piulis, midi Shono beshono.
Welcome to this Farbrengen on this auspicious day of Chofav, a day so dear to the Rebbe, and by extension, a day so dear to us and Chassidim. And this day is a day not only of inspiration and strength, but it's a day to focus on the life of the Rebbe's Holy Father and a day that we can not only learn and follow in his ways, but also to affect the goals that he stood for and that he had self-sacrifice for. As we heard from the Rebbe also mentioned how this is the Torah of his father, how it's increasingly learned year by year, and how the Sfarim, how his Torah is printed just by divine providence. A new Sefer of the Rebbe's father's Torah was brought this morning to the oil, both to the Tzion here in New York and to the Tzion of the Rebbe's Holy Father in Alma Ata. And we see that the day of the 20th of Av, the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's Holy Father, is the only day that we have a Farbrengen or mark by the Rebbe with Hasicha throughout the years of the Rebbe's Nesias from Tafshin Yud, from 5710, from 1950. The Rebbe always held a Farbrengen on the yahrzeit of his father. There are no other days. I don't know. We're sitting here with the great Chassidim, but this has been checked over. This is the only day that the Rebbe always Farbrengen was the yahrzeit of Chavav. This is just something to illustrate how close, obviously, it is the closest thing to the Rebbe's heart. The Rebbe mentioned his father's Torah, and as we continue, as we learn the Rebbe's Torah, you don't have to have the keenest and sharpest knowledge of Torah to see how the Rebbe's own Torah is patterned and guided and shaped by his father's Torah. And I'd like to introduce those that are sitting, we're Farbrengen here today, Rabbi Schmerling and Rabbi Mintz and Rabbi Taub and Rabbi Dubov. And I'd like to call on Rabbi Dubov to speak a little bit. I must say that Rabbi Dubov is also the one, he's the Mahadir, he's the one who edits and prepares for publication some of the Rebbe's father's Torah, which is quite complex, but he makes it palatable. So thank you so much for joining us today, Rabbi Dubov.
Thank you very much. So first I want to mention that you see very clearly, I'm going to give you an unbelievable mashal, an example that we have of the signum, the style, how the Rebbe would always Farbrengen. So we know mashal Shabbos would come, the Rebbe would come to Farbrengen, and right away he would tie everything together. So the parsha, the day of the week, if it was a Chodesh, if it was a special yahrzeit, everything had to be connected by Shgoch Pratis. And the Rebbe would give a bia and weave through all the details to show that's all one nakuda, it's all one point. So it's so interesting that we find this by the Rebbe's father. We find that the letter that the Rebbe's father sent to the Rebbe for his chasna, I think it was Vov Kislev and Tov Reish Peites. And it's interesting that Elachaim Altuis, who was then the Rebbe's guard, his shoima, he writes in his diary that he saw it. The Rebbe didn't hide it. He said there was a lot of Kabbalah over there. So the Rebbe, if you read the letter good, you will see that he ties in 5 things together in that letter. He says like this: your chasna is going to be number 1 on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Then he says it's going to be on the 14th day of the month, so it has to be a connection to the 14th day. It's Parshas Vayetze. Then it's the month of Kislev. And here he explains 2 pratim. What's the meaning of the name Kislev? And also, Kislev is the 3rd from the beginning of the year, Shlishi Lechadoshim. So all these five details, he goes one by one, and he connects all of it together, and he shows that it's all one nekuda, that the world, all these details tells us that the main reason of a chasna is that we should bring the world to tikkun, which means to the ultimate redemption of Mashiach Zetkein of Meher V'Mina Mamash. I just want to say one bracha to all of us, something that the Rebbe's father writes to the Rebbe, and he says, he explains him the bracha that we're now Chofov, we prepare ready for the new year, and he writes him a bracha Lashon Teva Mesukah, and he explains over there, it seems like a double expression, redundant. If it's a good year, then it's probably sweet. If it's sweet, then it's good. What's the Teva and Mesukah? But the answer is very simple. We all know that sometimes the Eibishter does good. There's no bad that comes from heaven, but not always do we see it. Where people were limited, we don't see the good. So in our eyes, it looks bad, but really, from Hashem's point of view, it's really good. So that's the bracha he told them. We should have, in his languages, gevura mimutokos. It means all these hidden goods. We don't want that. We want it should be mesuka, it should be sweet. By us, it should be sweet. L'chaim seven shava shona toiva. Ganz Klal Yisrael should be a good, and it should be only a sweet year. Kipshute kemashmoel. Shona toiva mesuka.
Amen. We're now going to continue the Farbrengen with the Hasidic singer Rabbi Avram Fried, who merited to sing by the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's mother, and she had much nachas, Rabbi Avram, who merited to sing by the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's mother, and she had much nachas, Rabbi Avram.
Yashe Koyach. Thank you, Rabbi Feller, for the kind words. Thank you, thank you. I was Zoiche, indeed, as a little boy, to be neighbors with Rebbetzin Chana, Aleh HaSholem, the Rebbe's mother. And being a little boy, I don't remember much, but my mother, Aleh HaSholem, would tell me that she would sometimes go to visit. We were neighbors next door. And she would say to me, Avrem will sing something. How she knew that I have a inkling or a chush in singing, I don't know. Maybe she heard us singing Zmidis, my family. And I was a little boy, a shy boy, and I would go behind the curtain, and I would sing for her from behind the curtain. What exactly I would sing, I don't remember. I imagine Lubavitchining, this is before Bring the House Down and No Jew Will Be Left Behind. And she one time gave me a 25-cent coin. I was very happy. A little boy, I ran to the nearest toy store, and I bought a water gun. I don't have the quarter or the water gun, but that's what I was able to get from the Rebbetzin. And I was told that in the name of Rabbi Weinberg, Olav HaSholem, the well-known Baal Tefillah by the Rebbe, that he was once standing outside of 1418 and talking to the Rebbetzin, and she said to him how much she enjoys listening to the Zmidis of the Friedman family, and especially Avremel, how he sings. And she said something to the effect that she believes, or she benches me, that I will yet have a big schus to be Mesameach Am Yisrael through singing. So Rabbi said, this is not my koiches, it's not koiche ve'oitzim yodi, this is all the brach of the Rebbetzin Chana, and of course the Idud and the Chizuk I've gotten the Rebbe over the years. So that's the whole story in under 2 minutes. So let's say L'chaim, we'll sing a Chassidische Nigen, L'chaim. I imagine that by Nagina also, there's probably an element of Menakala Lakovid. No, we can't just gain gleich to Atzilis, right? So something a little on the lighter side. Gershon, you ready? Ya mama mama ya mama ya mama 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 ay la da da la da da ay yo 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 today da 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 ya mama mama oh ya mama mama da mama 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 oh ida ya la da 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 mama 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 oh ye la da 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 mama mama ay la da 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 oh ida ya mama mama ay la da da ya mama da da ya mama Oh, you die, you die, la da da da. You da ma 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 ma, ah ma 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 ma. Ay da, la la da da da, ay la da da da, ya ma ma. Ay la da da, ya ma ma. Di-di-do, ay la da da da, ay la da da da. Ah ma 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 ma. Chaim v'livrocha.
In Tavshin Mem Ches, the Rebbe said, after my father-in-law, the Rebbe, left Russia, the only descendant of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek left in Russia was my father. So many people, for that reason, turned to him for guidance. And it was because of his efforts in spreading Yiddishkeit and Chassidus, he was imprisoned, where he later passed away.
During the infamous Beilis blood libel, the prosecutors tried to prove that Hasidim were especially involved in the murder. To refute their claims, numerous committees were established: a committee of lawyers, a committee of doctors, a committee of experts in Talmud, and a committee of experts in Kabbalah. The Rebbe Rashab appointed Reb Levi Yitzchok as one of the members of the committee of Kabbalists. He then appointed him as the head of that committee. Under his able guidance, they disproved the accusation from a Kabbalistic standpoint.
In Tishrei Tavshin Nun, Reb David Nachshon Rabbi Avi Taub gave the Rebbe the key to the newly renovated oil of his father. And the Rebbe took the key and asked him, "Is this the key to the oil?" The Rebbe then said, "You are very fortunate, your reward is great, and your merit is tremendous. You have inspired the Russian Jewish community, and you have helped fix the oilim of our holy and righteous Rebbeim. May there be no need to do this anymore, as they will soon arise with Tchias HaMesim."
After he was freed from Chile, Reb Levi Yitzchok spent the last few months of his life in Alma-Ata. At that time, Alma-Ata was a hub for all types of Jewish refugees fleeing from the Russian front. One day, a fight breaks out between some of the various groups. The argument pained Reb Levi Yitzchak greatly. He said, "When there's a famine, we don't look to see if the bread is white or black. As long as there is bread, why are people fighting at a time like this?"
Levitzo once visited Lubavitch and he was asked to give a shiur to the Bachim He gave a deep shiur that lasted more than an hour and a half. What was the shiur? Why the Alter Rebbe began the 12th chapter of Tanya with the word Ve'habeinu with a vav and not Habeinu without a vav?
In general, Rabbi Dubov mentioned the Gvuris Memutakis. Whenever we talk about the Rebbe's father's Torah, we always have to remember that what we have of the Rebbe's father's Torah is ketipa min hayam. It's a drop in the ocean. Most of his writings, unfortunately, we don't have, and we have a few volumes of that the Rebbe published of the Rebbe's father's writings. These were, some are writings that he wrote for himself, and some are correspondence, letters that he had with the Rebbe after the Rebbe left Russia. So they kept a steady correspondence back and forth. But I think that it wouldn't be a mistake to say that the concept of Gvura, Gvuras Memutakis, is a central theme in the Rebbe's father's Torah.
In other words, sweetening severity. In other words, something good coming out of the tough stuff.
And there's a famous Rishima that the Rebbe Levi Yitzchak wrote about himself and
his birthday.
The Golus, Ani, Levi Yitzchak, Ben Zalda Rachel. And he explains how everything is Gvura. Levi is Gvura, and Yitzchak is Gvura, and everything is Gvura. And throughout his life, he experienced Gvuras, what we would look at as simple Gvuras. But the theme of being Mamtik the Gvuras, that was like a central theme. Bichlal, when we're talking about the Rebbe's father's Torah, I remember when I was young, a young bacher in yeshiva, occasionally I looked up something that was in a sicha or in a maimer, mitzuyin to Shtikl Levi Yitzchak, Likut Levi Yitzchak, and open up. It was always scary looking, pages and pages and pages, no paragraphs, no notes, and Rosh Tevis and Kabbalah. But with the years, so it was the first one that really made me aware that this is, don't be so scared. Just go slowly and you'll see some interesting things. Was Reb Altake Friedman from Tzfas with the Penina Levi Yitzchak. Geschmackes things. He started looking into it. See, oh yeah, I can see
vignettes of his Torah.
I still don't understand everything. Sometimes it's shtiklach, and Rav Dubov is making an excellent job with the Yalkut Levi Yitzchak, the opening up Pashit and explaining in the footnotes the deep concepts. But besides for all the Kabbalah, and Reb Levi Yitzchak was very much into the Said, we see also that he demanded from the Rebbe in the correspondence that whenever the Rebbe would write to his father certain Chidushe Torah, again and again, Reb Levi Yitzchak would mention to him, you have to bring in more salt and pepper, tavlin and pilpulin. And he explains what he means. Be miyasid al pi Kabbalah more, so that it will be a full picture. It will be a fuller picture if you'll base it more on Kabbalah. So a lot of people are under the impression that all his Torah is Kabbalah, but that's not so. And there is also Nigla. There was a whole correspondence between the Rebbe's father and the Rebbe, where they had a fierce argument in Nigla of Torah.
In Talmudic aspects of the Torah.
Yeah. There, in that context.
About purity and impurity, if I remember correctly.
No, not that one. That's also, but Machshav of Truma and Kotchim and Kabbanis.
The thought process of donating to the Beis HaMikdash and what the thought accomplishes.
True. But to appreciate that, I'll mention another point. There's a famous story that Reb Levi Yitzchak went to get smicha from Reb Chaim Brisker. And while he was there, a shaila came up about the sukkah. The people, an Eruv, in the courtyard, they forgot to make an Eruv. And Reb Chaim told Reb Levi Yitzchak, what do you say to how to deal with this problem? So he suggested, and Reb Chaim liked that very much, that the fact that they're eating in the same sukkah, that is me'arev. It makes them all join together, and it's okay. Years later, Reb Gavriel Zinner, the Nite Gavriel, wrote to the Rebbe that he found this idea that the sukkah can be me'arev in the Me'irian Masechta Eruvin. So the Rebbe answered him. First, the Rebbe thanked him very much for this Maramokim Achi Choshuv. But then the Rebbe writes to him, obviously you're aware that in Russia, they didn't have these Sfarim, and some of these Sfarim weren't even printed yet at the time. The Meiri, indeed, was not yet in print. Was only years later did it was it published Bechlal. And that's besides for the point that many have the minhag to focus more on learning Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and maybe some more Sfarim and not more. But that was the point that the Rebbe made. Now here's an interesting thing. The Rebbe and the Rebbe's father argued about machshava in kachim, that if somebody decides this animal should be a korban, does the animal become holy just by thinking about it, or do you have to verbally designate it? So the Rebbe wrote to his father a question that in the Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe says that it's that you have to say it bepeh, you have to be makdish bepeh, you have to verbally designate it. So the Rebbe asks his father, there's a Gemara that kol nediv leiv, that just by deciding in the heart. So the Rebbe's father writes back to the Rebbe, I don't understand you. I'm wondering, how do you even ask such a question? It is a very simple concept that the fact that b'machshavot, in thought, you become obligated, that's only the obligation on the person, that by deciding to do it, it obligates him to follow through, but not that the animal becomes Kaddish. The animal is not yet holy until you verbally designate it. And that these are two separate concepts. So the Rebbe wrote back, we don't have the Rebbe's letter that he wrote to his father, but the Rebbe made notes on the letter that he got from his father, a whole bunch of sources in Shas and Poskim, where that's not so simple. And apparently he also wrote that back to his father because his father wrote back. And I see that you're not happy with my answer, he writes. The Terutzi is not good for you. And he again explains with further Marmakamis. And he writes, what you write from the Rambam, that it's obvious in the Rambam, what is obvious to you, for me, this is not obvious at all. And he argues, the Rebbe wrote back, holding his ground. And the Rebbe's father wrote back again. This is going back and forth, a fierce argument in halacha. We don't know where in the correspondence, it didn't go further, but we know that years later, the Rebbe was already here in America. The Rebbe wrote a tshuva in Tshuva Siburim, an entire footnote, where the Rebbe again is writing his opinion very strongly, basing it, Rashi, Tosfos, Rambam, all the Rishonim. Now here's the interesting point. The Rebbe's view and his father's view is actually a machlokes harishonim that only came to light also only now that we have the Meiri. The Meiri writes exactly what Reb Levi Yitzchak writes. The differentiation between the person's obligation versus the korban becoming Kaddish, he writes it exactly like Reb Levi Yitzchak, not in the same words, but the concept, he writes it out that don't ask me that it says in the Gemara about machshav kol nediv leiv, because that's talking about the person's obligation and not about the holiness of the animal. So it comes out that the Rebbe was like expressing the views of Rashi and Tosfos, the way the Rebbe learned Pshat, and his father actually was writing what he didn't have at the time, like the Rebbe writes to Rav Gavriel Zinner. It didn't exist yet, it wasn't around. It was in manuscripts, hidden away yet. But he had the same, learned the Gemaras exactly the way the Meiri learned it. That is a fascinating concept.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the caliber of the Torah of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's Holy Father were certainly. I mean, for us, it's tougher to grade these things. We're not. This is beyond our pay grade. But when you see it clearly in the Rishonim that this is what they were talking about, and there's clearly they didn't see, it's fascinating to see. Rabbi Mintz.
This idea of Achdus B'Torah that Rabbi David mentioned, we know it from Kimat every Sikha. How many Sikhas the Rebbe illustrates how a Rambam, a Halacha,
Ashtikli Gemara Rashi can be best understood and sometimes only understood through the Yeinish Torah, through the Pnimis HaTorah. In general, we find that the idea of Machatzti Vani Erpa, the Rebbe speaks like the Rashbi, that they were the pioneers throughout generations that merged the two Torahs, the Nigla and Nister of Torah. Oftentimes, the Rebbe points, for example, to the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was Mishal of Nigla and Nister. But interestingly, I heard this from Mashpia that the Tzemach Tzedek, indeed, you find oftentimes the intersection between the two, but there's a kesha. He illustrates a kesha between Nigla and Nister. Dafke in the Rebbe's Torah, we find not only a kesha between the two, but how the two are chativa achas, how the two are essentially misunderstood without the other element. Nigla the Torah can sometimes and oftentimes only be understood through Pnimis HaTorah. So this idea, we see it oftentimes in the Rebbe's Torah. Hamoin Sichis and Maimorim and Maimis and Setlach, we see this idea. But we can trace the origin of this ichud in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. In a moedic way, we see it constantly. You mentioned the Rishima, that they arrived just before, I believe it's 55 years, Chaf of Tavshin Chaf Hei, with the Rishim Anil Yitzchak when Zalderachel arrived. They came together with a few ksavim with Alter Rebbe. They said Bashgacha Pratis had arrived just before Chafa. The Rebbe mentioned in Fabring before Chafa once again. And in that Sikha, the Rebbe said, the end of the Fabring Chafa of Tavshin Chaf Hei, that we see here the concept of Yadul Torah v'Yader, in a way that Torah, in the Torah of his father, is mamish, is unified as one. And the Rebbe says, for example, every Rav, Mechabrim, Rabbonim who wrote, when a concept comes up in Torah, they see on their Shafa, Sforim and Nista the Torah, they have before them ideas, and they're able to connect the two. But the Rebbe points out that much of the ksavim that we have from Rebbe Levi Yitzchak was without any Sforim. And it wasn't that he saw a pshat in a sefer in the morning.
He didn't have Google. He didn't have
access. You know? He didn't have access to any
no
Sforim.
Search engine.
And Sapshat, he saw something in the morning, and later that day he saw something. It was, and here you see that it was part of the etzem uhus, the ishuto, the personality, the derech halimud. The way of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was that at the core was ichud nigla and nister. And this is an idea that we find throughout in the Rebbe's Torah. There's a famous sichel called the Sichel Chafal Va'era. The Rebbe speaks to this, that the ichud of nigla Torah, where the Rebbe quotes Ein, that oftentimes in nigla we find that Ein ho'inyi benigla ela dasheni beprimis haTorah. Oftentimes in Yonim nigla cannot be understood, and the Rebbe mentions of the end that sichel in Ha'ara, that this is the distinction between Re'iyah and Shmiya. Shmiya, we hear something, we hear one element, and then Shmiya, the idea of hearing. We hear one concept in Nigla, and later we hear another concept, the same idea as it's expressed in the inner dimensions of Torah, Primis HaTorah, and we connect the two. Re'iyah, on the other hand, when we see something that's visual, we're able to see a composite of both simultaneously. We could see it at once. And the Rebbe says this, we find this in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, and we know that this closing of the gap between Nigla and Nister is something that the Rebbe took much further, not only in areas of Torah, but in all areas of our life. We see this also in the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe, for example, once sent, I believe it was before Pesach, you mentioned, the Rebbe sent a pair of shoes to his father, and he receives a letter back from the Rebbe's father. He receives a letter back describing al pi nigla, al pi nister, the concept of na'alayim. The Rebbe once described in a letter that he moved into a new apartment that had two rooms in the apartment. There was a reply back. Al pi nister, the idea of two. So everything that Rebbe Leivik saw, he didn't just see it the way it's on the surface.
But about the na'alayim, after writing that whole piece, Hidrich ban the Olive, at the end he concludes, Heim Toiv. They're good. They fit.
So here we see this idea was something that Yesoidosoi, Baharei Kodesh, the Ichud of Nigla and Nister, and the Ichud of Kol Chelkei Ha'olam is mevusis and meyusid very much on the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. And finally, the end of that Sicha, Chel Chafal, the Rebbe concludes that through seeing Torah, the Oifen Shal Re'iyah, as one, we bring closer, we hasten the Bias HaMashiach, which the idea of Mashiach is also a Yechida, which is Ma'achet Kol Yisrael in Oifen Avriya, the Nigle Kvoid Hashem V'ro Kol Basa Yachdav. So when we
Deepest part
learn,
of our soul.
it connects. The limud is Mekarev Bias Mashiach, when this will be revealed, when we will all look at a pair of shoes and see it through the lens of Rabbi Yitzchak. Ayimos HaMashiach. Chaim, Chaim.
Chaim, thank you. You know, I think another piece of the Rebbe's Torah, which we see clearly is rooted in the Rebbe's Holy Father's Torah, is the significance of every point. Sometimes when I have an opportunity to share some of the Torah, and people say, like, that's not a question, that's not. Well, why is that important? That's not even that's not even in the running. But we see that the Rebbe's father in his Torah shows that each and every detail is significant. Every letter, there's no such thing as a side detail. Maybe Rabbi Taub will address that idea.
So, first of all, when we're talking about scholarship, we're talking about scholars in general. You know, there are people who are very smart and very learned, and then there are holy people. The Rebbe's father clearly was a scholar. I mean, even people like us can make that evaluation. But what we get a glimpse of is something far beyond scholarship. It's one thing to be able to take every detail in a piece of Torah and to expound upon the significance of every seemingly insignificant detail, which Rebbe's father very clearly did in thousands of instances. That's one thing. But what strikes me, at least for me personally, made such an impression, and I have to thank Rabbi Duba for making this possible, the way you opened up that Rishima, that note that the Rebbe's father wrote at the darkest time in his life, and at a time where a regular person would not be able to go on. And the Rebbe's father is writing about every detail of the persecution and the imprisonment and the trial, and finding meaning in it all. So it's like, it's one thing to sit in a yeshiva and to delve into the text and find one detail and another detail and another as a scholar. But to literally to see life this way and to see life this way at the most challenging moments, that's a whole other level, just a whole other level.
אנו נמצאים כאן בעיר ניקולאייב, אוקראינה, עיר הולדתו של הרבי, בבית הארכיון הממשלתי של העיר. אנו רואים את המסמך המקורי של רישום הנישואין של הרבנית חנה לבעלה הגדול, רב לוי יצחק. כמו כן, אנחנו רואים פה את רישומי הלידה המקוריים של שלושת בניהם. זוהי תעודת הלידה של הרבי, בנם בכורם. זוהי תעודת הלידה של רבי ישראל אריה לייב, וזוהי תעודת הלידה של אחיהם רב דויבברג. אנו נמצאים כאן כעת על יד ביתו של רב העיר, הרב מאיר שלמה ינובסקי, עליו השלום. בבית זה התגוררו חמיו וחמותו של בעל ההילולה, הרב מאיר שלמה עליו השלום, והרבנית רחל השם ימקום דומה ינובסקי. מדי שנה היה הרבי אומר קדיש לעילוי נשמתה של הסבתא, שנרצחה בידי הנאצים יימח שמם בכ"ד תשרי תש"ב. דבר נפלא התגלה לפני 30 שנה בדיוק, בכ"ד תשרי תש"ן, בעת הגעה של שיחת קודש מיוחדת שהרבי הקדיש לרגל היורצייט שלה. הרבי הוסיף רישום בכתב יד קודשו, בה חשף היורצייט דהימי זקנתי רחל השם ימקום דומה, אשת אבי זקני הרב הגאון וכולו וכולו ינובסקי ניקולאייב. כמה שבועות בסיום חודשי הקיץ, כמה שנים הייתי בניקולאייב וטיפלה בי וכולו. הוא על שנים בהם המשפחה כבר התגוררה בעיר יקטרינוסלב, והרבי הגיע לשהות בביתם של הסבא והסבתא בחודשי הקיץ. בשנת תרס"ה, כאשר הרבי היה בגיל 3, התעורר גל של פוגרומים ברחבי רוסיה ואוקראינה, שהתמקד בעיקר בקהילות היהודיות. גם בעיר זו התארגנו הבריונים האנטישמים להפליא את מכותיהם ביהודי העיר. גם משפחת שניאורסון נמלטה מביתה והגיעה למקום המסתור של המשפחות היהודיות. מנהרה צרה מתחת למרתף של בית מרקחת, כמה קומות מתחת לפני הקרקע עד יבור זעם. אנו עומדים כעת ממש במקום בו התחבא הרבי יחד עם הוריו באותה תקופה. ברשימת זיכרונותיה מספרת הרבנית חנה שבאחד הימים החלו ילדים שהיו מבוהלים מאוד לבכות מרוב פחד, והיה חשש גדול שהבכי יסגיר את מקום המחבוא, וזה הכניס את כולם בסכנה גדולה. אימה ופחד נפלו על כולם. חוסר האונים, כותבת הרבנית, היה גדול מאוד. לפתע, כותבת הרבנית, נמצא ילד אחד רגוע, קטן. זה היה בני מנחם מנדל בן 3. בתושייה של אדם גדול, הוא החל לעבור בין הילדים הקטנים ולהרגיע אותם. כאשר הוא עובר מאחד לאחד, לוחש דבר מה על האוזן, מניק משהו קטן, והפלא ופלא, הילד הקטן הזה הצליח להחזיר את השקט למקום המסתור. בזכות זה ניצלו חייהם של כל אלה שהתחבאו במרתף הסתרים הזה.
אנחנו עומדים עכשיו ברחוב מירונובה, מספר 9. על הרחוב הזה הרב אומר, דורט נידו הגס וסגיהר צומיר. יש שם רחוב ששייך אליי.
Могу и сверху. Вы говорите по-русски уже? Каменецкий?
Das ist ihr Mutter, Mrs. Lipski, fährt zusammen mit ihr.
Ihre Tikazinusla. Weil in Kazinusla dort Hamol Jurati, da Gaswas gerät ziemlich von Sache das Loch. Bitte schön.
פה כל החיים התנהלו. הרב גר פה ממול ברחוב מירונובה 20, והרב כותב שהוא זוכר שהם היו חוצים את הכביש קצת לשמאל ובאים לבית כנסת שזה רחוב מירונובה 9, כאן הבית כנסת של רב לייביק. מפה התנהלו כל החיים היהודיים של העיר, כל השיעורים בקבלה שהוא נתן ליהודי העיר, כל מה שאנחנו שומעים על דניפרופטרובסק, יקטרינוסלב, הכל התנהל מפה. זה בית כנסת שניתן במתנה לרב העיר רב לייביק, מיהודי בשם פלי, שהעניק את זה במתנה לרב לייביק. ופה אנחנו רואים את השלט. בבית הכנסת הזה התפללו במשך שנים רבות הרב הקדוש רב לוי יצחק שניירסון ובנו הרבה. תוך 50 בתי כנסת שנלקחו מהיהודים, כולל גם את הבית כנסת של רב לייביק ברחוב מירונובה 9, השאירו בית כנסת אחד פתוח, בית כנסת לא גדול, ופה הם שלטו בכל הבא וכל היוצא, ופה התפלל רב לייביק במשך 4 שנים, מתוף ריש צדיק ה' עד תוף ריש צדיק תס, ועכשיו ניכנס בפנים לראות את הבית כנסת כפי שהוא היה. הפנים של הבית כנסת נשאר עדיין עד היום. אנחנו נמצאים עכשיו בתוך בית הכנסת, איפה שרב לייביק התפלל במשך 4 שנים, מתוף ריש צדיק ה' עד תוף ריש צדיק תס, השנים הכי קשות, כשכבר התחילו הלחצים והאיסורים והרדיפות. כשהגענו לפה בתוף שינון, באנו לבית כנסת הזה, היו פה כמה זקנים מופלגים שזכרו את רב לייביק מהתפילות שהם התפללו איתו בשנים ההם.
חוקרים גילו לאחרונה שהבית הזה שנמצא כאן מאחוריי, זה הבית שהוא נשאר על תילו בדיוק באותו צורה כפי שהוא נראה עכשיו. זה הבית שבעצם גרו רב לייביק והרב סנחנה והמשפחה גרו בבית הזה. כאן בעצם התקיימה הבר מצווה בי"א ניסן, לאחר שהחגיגה הייתה בבית הכנסת, המשיכו כולם לכאן והחגיגה המשיכה מ-12 בצהריים ועד מוצאי שבת, המשיכה חגיגה, וגם הסבא הגיע מלובביץ' במיוחד לבר מצווה, והוא הביא את ברכתו של הרבי הרש"ב.
פה אנחנו רואים את הבית של רב לייביק, רב צנחנה, ואנחנו רואים את השלט, כתוב פה בבית הזה התגורר כבוד קדושת הגאון המקובל רבי לוי יצחק שניירסון, זכר צדיק לברוכה, רבה הראשי של יקטרינוסלב, דניאפו פוטרובסק, בין השנים תרס"ט, תרצ"ט, ומהמקום הזה, בתרצ"ט, בטס ניסן, ב3 לפנות בוקר, הגיעו 4 חוקרים מהאן כבדה, כפי שמתארת הרבנית חנה בזכרינס שלה, את כל מה שקרה פה במקום הזה, ומפה הם לקחו אותו לבית סוהר, במרתפים האיומים של בניין הקג"ב שנמצא 5 דקות נסיעה מפה.
הישר מהבית שראינו זה עתה ברחוב בריקדנה, הוא נלקח לכאן למקום הזה שעומד מאחוריי, הוא נלקח לכאן בט' ניסן, תרצ"ט, באמצע הלילה, הוא נלקח לכאן לחקירות, ישב פה כמה זמן, ומכאן נלקח לעוד חקירות שהיו גם פה בעיר וגם בקייב, עד שהוא חזר לפה, עד שהוא נשלח לגלות בצ'יאלי, וזה היה בשנת תש. אי אפשר לתאר את הכאב לב ואת העוגמת נפש ואת הצער והכאב הגדול שהיה למשפחת בית הרב באותו זמן. אנחנו בעזרת השם גם נוכל ללכת ולראות את המקום עצמו, איפה שהחזיק אותו, שהוא לא השתנה והוא נשאר בדיוק אותו דבר על פי העדויות שיש.
אנחנו נכנסים לתוך התא, בו ישב הרב לוי יצחק. מזמן המאסר שלו, במהלך המאסר תחקרו אותו פה ושלחו אותו לקייב. מקייב שלחו אותו בחזרה לדנפר, והכל היה תוך 1.5 שנה, עד שפסקו גירוש למקום נידח בקזחסטן, כפר בשם צ'ילי, שבו אין שום יהודים, היה אסור לו ליצור קשר עם שום יהודים, ושם הוא היה עד שנת 1943, עד תש"ג. ומאז הרשו לו להתיישב ולגור בעיר הבירה של קזחסטן, אלמטי. ושם הוא נפטר בשנת 1944, תש"ד.
Und wie sie Tage danach gewähnt, der Fall ist gewähnt bei Brisa Suri, wo dort sie gewähnt die Möglichkeit auf Leben in Teir und mit keinem sein Mitzvahs, wie sie darf zu sein. Und man hat so gewusst, dass was sich missassig sein, für Kashrus, wie schlimm, wie Tehidur, bei Negei, zu Kimche, de Pische, wie Kajetse, is Olu, und weil Adra bederach Hateva das gedacht bringen zu einem Meister und dann noch der weiter die Kinyonim und wie sie Tage gewähnt bepeil, aber das hat dann noch gestärkt, bei einer Gehe zu Limo die Masmei, Kiem Amitzvus Baatzmei, wo sie geworden am Masmei, was rein ist, Tage Rachmone Pater, aber der Reit der Linien fällt, und auf all Piken hat sich der Baba Hailula nicht vorgestellt und hat es getan mit dem ganzen Sturm.
To bring us into the mood of this beautiful nigun, please enjoy the beautiful violin playing of Stanislav Reb Michal Zlotchever's nigun.
geschickt in Tafshin Beis Elul Kisveyad von der Rebbe zu Vayat von Mashab von der Vater, Rebbe's Vater, Chidush Levi Yitzchak al-Gittin hat ihn gedruckt von dem. Ich habe es geschickt von Eretz Israel, ich habe es gefunden.
Jeder geschrieben, ja, und ich habe richtig ja verkehrt.
Ich handle mit den alten Sachen. Ich habe es gefunden mit der Pelle.
Das sind nicht genau die Sachen, dass ich nicht Kachadosh, sondern Chadosh im Mann.
Das gedruckt, Chidush Levi Yitzchak al-Gittin.
Ja, ich bin dort zwischen Berlin, das haben so schön gelernt. Wir lernen das weiter, weil die Leute sehr viel lieben, das lernen wir gleich noch stellen. Wir sagen nach Chova Mamash, wir sagen Psuri-Stelle. Das Woche in der Chova Union, das kann ich dir gut.
Das ist nicht gut für meinen Schwager.
Wir sagen Psuri-Stelle.
Ich bin ja gewesen mit euren Eltern, ich habe geredet mit eurer Taten, mit eurer Mama, auch schon im PLP. Aber viele hat mir gegeben, am Matze, auf dem ersten Kosa ist es Pesach. Und er gedacht, weg von Almat, habe ich in Balit im Waggon. Gekommen eine Plemienice, Fin Alma Ata, in Sizilien. Im Gewinn verschieben sie, a Chodosh im Fine finden.
Ja, das war ein guter Besuch, ein größten Dank für der Grüß. Das war ein guter Besuch, haben lange gesunde Jahre, fröhliche Jahre.
I remember meeting that Jew in 1990 in Tovshin Nun in Minsk. His name was Kaplan. I remember meeting him, and we said we must bring him to the Rebbe to give this was a live regards. And he said he was 5 months with the Rebbe's father. You see how much how the Rebbe appreciated it. L'chaim, l'chaim.
I remember when he came. That was like a year later. Tafshin Aleph. I remember seeing him around 770. But
so we see that the Rebbe here the Rebbe told the gentleman that found the manuscript of the Rebbe's father's Torah and Gittin. It was published, I believe, in Tov Shemim Hey. They had come to the Rebbe years later saying that they're the ones who sent it in. But the Rebbe said that thousands have already learned it and many more will learn it. And there's, as of late, more and more are joining this idea of learning this Torah. And we have the Yalkut Levi Yitzchak ala Torah. We also have we find something very, very interesting that in 1990 they're saying in Tov Nun, that was the first time that the Rebbe actually allowed his name to be used for the name of a sefer in relation to printing Torah of his father. Like Rebbe Duba mentioned earlier, maybe you'll talk about it. How the Rebbe really learned a piece of his father's Torah by every Farbrengen. Would you like to share some of how that worked and talk a little bit about the name of that sefer the Rebbe allowed, Torahs Menachem Tiferes Levi Yitzchak, which we just actually had the final 2 volumes were printed with some more pieces that the Rebbe had originally not given to print in the earlier volumes when he gave his letters. We see the Rebbe wanted to share. Those letters were the most dear thing the Rebbe had in terms of his possessions, and he shared it with us because of the Torah content. But the praises that his father gave him, he said, you don't have to share that, but now they've been shared too. So Rabbi Duval.
So as I mentioned earlier, this is like a Rebbe thing. No one asks questions. We don't understand exactly why. But when it came to the 25th yard site, the Rebbe started to print the manuscripts and the writings of his father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. And then, that time, as soon as it started to come out, the Rebbe would, every Shabbos, Farbrengens, he would expound on his father's, what's called Ha'oris, his footnotes. We have the famous thing that I remember I once heard from the Pesach, who he really spoke about great enthusiasm, that it's mind-boggling where the Rebbe took those years, Tavshin Chavtes, 69, 70, 71, and it's the only thing that we have in a complete fashion. The Rebbe took all his father's footnotes on the Gersa Tshuva, and he explained each one of them in great detail. And if you put it together, the Rebbe's explanation on his father, it's like a new Gersa Tshuva that it's like he opened up like a different world. As once he finished the Tanya, then as years went on, we used to see the Rebbe used to come down for Farbrengen. He would come down with a Chumash. He would come down with his father's sefer, and we would sit.
The Rebbe would bring it down.
Sure.
In my years, it was already unique.
Later
would put it on the
they
table before Farbrengen. So this is very interesting. I never knew that the Rebbe himself used to bring it down.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Later on, it was set up.
But every Shabbos, now by Chassidim saw an interesting thing, that the Rashi Sichos started in Tov Shin Chav in 1965 after Reb Sechana passed away, Vav Tishrei, and that already Shabbos Noyach, the Rebbe started to launch the Rashi Sichos. And from then on, you see an interesting thing. Every single Shabbos, he honored his parents. There was a Rashi Sichos in honor of his mother, and there was the Biyurim, the explanations on the Zoya, that was for his father. Later on, the Rebbe used to always also talk about the Rambam, which is like his own personal thing. But this was every Shabbos guaranteed. So this just shows that he wanted all of us to include in the learning of his father. And many sichos in the Kuta Sichos you will see the Rebbe was Magia, beautiful Biyurim from all those fabulous sichos.
I remember 40 years ago at the Farbrengen of Chafov in Tavshin Mem, the Rebbe established the Koil Tferes Keinim Levi Yitzchak. He named the learning with seniors after his father as one of the projects, and that was something that we've heard from people who were with the Rebbe's father in not only in his city where he was the Rav, but later on when he was in Kazakhstan in exile, he also organized groups to study with people, both children's groups and groups of whoever was there, including elderly Jews who were there because they were running from the war, or whatever it was. And here the Rebbe made that project. The Rebbe also established a fund in the name of his father.
You mentioned this. I will share with you a new answer that just we also saw it recently when there was the first gathering for the elderly. And if you remember, these were all like Russians, from Brighton Beach, men, elderly men, women, and more wonderful people, but more on the simplistic side. And they wrote in the schedule of what's going to be was a whole hour before the Rebbe had mincha with them. The first time they had a gathering with the Rebbe for the elderly Tferes Keinim Levi Yitzchak. When they wrote in the schedule, the only thing that the Rebbe commented, it's printed over here. So they wrote that there's going to be an opening words, and it'll be like for 15 minutes. The Rebbe added these words. What should be the opening words? B'dvar Malchus, words of royalty. Mitoyrosei Shel, and then he circles Levi Yitzchak, from the Torah from my father. That should be the Dvar Malchus. And then he wrote, Hamuvon lahane esofim, which should be understood to these who are gathered. That means bring it down in simple terms. But you see from this answer that the Rebbe wanted that his Torah should be spread, his father's Torah, to every single level of Jews, not only to the scholars, these who are in yeshiva, goinim, as you mentioned before, even simplistic people. And there are beautiful things that you said before on Pesach. The Rebbe's father wrote, it's a big mistake, these who think it's true, he was a Makubal, and he wrote Kabbalah, but there's so much there in Pshat, in Remez, in Drush, and in Soit. All levels that everyone, you could find something that he spoke to everyone.
In the Mamorim of the Rebbe, the discourses, which is certainly the most profound, deepest, like even people of our caliber see that, how the Rebbe delivered a mimer, how it was with a song before, and people stood, and the Rebbe closed his eyes, and he held a handkerchief, or whatever. The mimer is certainly the pinnacle of the Rebbe's Torah that we could see. So on certain occasions, the Rebbe mentioned Torah clearly and specifically from all the Rabbeim. And in the later years, we see also he mentioned also Torah from his father within the Mamorim, and that's how it's printed. But as I'm learning a little bit more, as time goes on, we study a little bit more of the Rebbe's father, I see the Rebbe implicitly mentions his father's Torah in all of the Mamorim, even earlier, when it's not clear, and then he doesn't mention it in the name of his father. It's clearly already, the Rebbe's Mamorim are replete with chassidus of his father, of these concepts, and especially those Mamorim of Yud Shvat, when the Rebbe mentioned all the Rabbeim the other times. Do you want to add something, Rabbi Shmurli?
About what you just mentioned there. Lahak was preparing now because of the Corona crisis. It wasn't printed. And also Chaim Shol was in the hospital, so they print my Maimorim for Yomim Tovim, so a volume of my Maimorim for Chag HaShavuos, but it didn't get printed for this past Chag HaShavuos. But I was looking over the Maimorim, and there was one concept that was mentioned in a Maimer, but there was no footnote. Where does that come from? I remembered that in Likutei Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father writes that Rosh Hashanah is something, I don't recall right now what it was about. And so I told him to add on the Ma'amakim. It's the Rebbe's father's Torah. That's exactly what you just mentioned. That there is a word from Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe didn't say that it's from the Rebbe's father. Talking about the Rebbe's, the Ktoim, the pieces from the letters that the Rebbe's father wrote to the Rebbe, praising the Rebbe, that were printed now for the first time. There's a lot of fascinating things over there. But one very
Rebbe's
fascinating
humility, and that you're raised.
That's exactly that. The Rebbe's father writes that what you're writing about your Divrei Torah, she'ein b'hem chidush, that there's nothing novel in there. I disagree with you. And im kotin ato beinecha, if you are small in your eyes, if you hold yourself small in your eyes, harei roish v'chulu. Now, this is a quote from a pasuk. There's a pasuk in Shmuel where it says, im kotin ato beinecha, if you hold yourself humble, harei roish shifta Yisrael ato, ve'im shochacho Hashem lekecha melech, Hashem anointed you as king. Now, the Rebbe's father does not conclude this whole pasuk, but it just begins that pasuk, and it's an allusion to that concept that, know who you are. And this is a very interesting thing, because we know that Rebbe Levi Yitzchak is a direct descendant from the oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek, Reb Baruch Shalom. And he was the only son of the Tzemach Tzedek who did not become a Rebbe. And there is a well-known Kabbalah by Chassidim that the Tzemach Tzedek told Reb Baruch Shalom that in that merit, one of his future descendants will be a leader, will be a manig. And he mentioned the pasuk, Dai Revi Yashuva Heinu. It's a pasuk in Bereshit, Dai Revi, the fourth generation will return. When the shidduch between the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin happened, they say that Rebbe Levi Yitzchak said, now he understands that this Dai Revi, fourth generation, is not from Reb Baruch Shalom, it's from the Rebbe Marash, meaning Messiah Chabad, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, the Friedrich Rebbe, and then the Rebbe. So if Rebbe Levi Yitzchak saw that when the Shidduch came about, then this piece in the letter takes on a whole new significance, and as Chassidim, the appreciation is immense.
He told me that he heard this word from Reb Shmuel Levittin in Ashir Tanya in 1970. So he's the mucker for this.
Wow.
So this, and he was he knew what he's saying.
That's very interesting. In the Toilus Levi Yitzchak,
I know
no source is cited, and I was wondering. Thank you very much.
I just heard this year.
Yeah.
He was talking. He told me he heard it. He heard it in Ashir Tanya.
Obviously,
you're talking about Toilus Levi Yitzchak. That's also such a phenomenal story behind that. The biography of the Rebbe's father, and it was written by a Jew called Rabbi Gottlieb from Eretz Yisrael, who realized that the Torah is coming out, and we don't even know anything about the persona or the personality of the Rebbe's father. And he started to do something. He wrote to the Rebbe, he asked permission if he could write even a letter, and he had never seen the Rebbe, and he came 2 years later, and by Kushel Bracha, the Rebbe said, "What's with the book?" He didn't even know how do you even know how I look? And when he wrote 2 years earlier,
you need an answer for this. You need a summer,
And then the Rebbe guided him in specific details and told him where to look who to speak to.
And eventually the Rebbe looked over the book. And just like about the letters, where the Rebbe said that certain parts don't have to be printed, the Rebbe took out stories from
about his own greatness.
Toilus Levi Yitzchak that talk about the Rebbe's greatness. That's not part of the biography of my father. Take that out.
the Poltavenigen. בניגון הזה אפשר לשמוע את הגעגועים של הנשמה. The neshama is longing for a bissel Gettlichkeit. By the way, I think by Achsidische Nigen, it's not so much was der Singer sagt, but was sagt der Nigen. And it's not so much what the singer is saying, but it's what is the song saying. That's what we need to pay attention to by Achsidisch Verbringen, Achsidische Nigen. Was sagt der Nigen? The singer is Seder. Der Poltava Nigen sagt, als bängt sich געגועים לאבינו שבשמיים, במקום כל ההסתר והמסכות, שיהיה גילוי אליקוס Beroch al Basar Yachtav. Wir wollen sehen, unsere Taten. Na 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 ahidim ahidum oh ilara amamai na ahidim ahidum tidiya na 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 ahidim ahidum tidiyahi na 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 ahidim ahidum oh ilara amamam ahidim ahidum lidira
to share with you a story which brings out the chshivas that the Rebbe had to going to Almatah. In Tovshin on Aleph, Rav Moshe Slonim brought up a yuzma to make the third kinus ha'izayri from Europe in Moscow to go to Lubavitch, and the culmination and the high point, and the reason it was done at those dates was because the shluchim wanted to be by Reb Leivik in Almatah on Chofav. Came to Almatah, and there was a meeting. There were a few hundred of the local Jews, and we spoke to Divrei Seirus. We spoke about Reb Leivik. Everybody there knew about. Your heart could cry. The Rebbe writes about his father, V'nifter begoyle. It's not only V'nifter begoyle. In those days, to walk to Reb Leivik's tzion, you had to go through a cemetery, which is not a Jewish one, with all non-Jewish symbols. And it breaks your heart because the Jewish cemetery is in a corner of that cemetery. Maybe 150, 200 kvarim, if that much. And there is laying Hatzadik Reb Leivik, the Rebbe's father, our Zayda. We came there, we sang the Nigun of Reb Levi Yitzchak, we sang Hu Elikenu, we sang Shuva. I spoke, we learned some of the Torah of Reb Leivik. Then we went in, and Leibel Raskin, who was zeicher to be by the Estalkas of Reb Leivik, read the Pidyon, read the Achlotas of the Kinnis. And it was there that we thought that we're closing the Kinnis by the Tzion. We had a issue that the plane had to go back at 12 o'clock because it had a scheduled run to Tashkent. In those days, the pilots owned the planes. They had the keys to the plane, and for a couple of bottles of mashke, they asked then, I think, it was 80,000 ruble. But the guy made one condition. He has a scheduled run to Tashkent, and he must be back at 7:30 to make that run. So he must leave Almatah no later than 12:15. That night we got a directive from the Rebbe that the Rebbe wants we should daven all three tefillas in Almatah. The earliest you could daven mincha was at 1:27. And we had to leave at 12:15. With broken hearts we went to the airport, and the first few people started to go out to the plane. All of a sudden, there became a sandstorm, the likes of which you never saw. Sand blowing, a big wind. You couldn't see a foot in front of you. So we went back up, and we sat down to Fabring. Rebbe Levine Fabranged about and told a story. He mesmerized the crowd with a story about the file of Reb Leivik that was just found at that period of time. And we Fabranged, and then all of a sudden, 1:25, we stood up to daven mincha, and we davened mincha, and right after that, we're able to board the plane and go back. When came back, I got a call that the Rebbe said we should visit the Yarei HaMeledes of Chabad, Liyozhnen Liyadi. That became an impossibility because everybody had already gone to their flights. So it was a matter that there was nobody to go with. And that always, I promised the Rebbe that there will be a time that we will fulfill this. After 25 years, we were able to fulfill that promise to the Rebbe of going to Liyozhnen Liyadi. And from there, we went again to Almatah. The first time when we were there in Tovshin Nun Aleph, it was the first time that there was a kibbutz of Chassidim that came, that was zeicher to be on the tzion of Reb Leivik. 25 years later, we went with a plane, a 747 Jumbo, with 450 shluchim, who was zeicha again to be on the Tzion, b'yom ha'ilula, b'yom ha'kodesh, with the Ishtadlus of Rabbi Avram Yisrael Shulzan, who paid for the plane to go. Just like by the first kinnis, Rabbi Lazar involved very much 25 years later. But to be by the Tzion of Rabbi Leivik and to ask by the Zayda Brochis that we should be Zeicha, that the Rebbe should take us to Eretz Yisrael, and we should be Zeicha to the Gula Amitas Vashlema, and to undertake this Sederis, that it's not that we were there on our own, but we were there the first time and the second time. Shluchei Shalodam K'maisei, was if the Rebbe was there himself. And the Hatzloch of both times was not because anyone organized it. You could see that the Rebbe was running these Kenusim. Poshet Begashmias, the Hatzloch and Mufloga that it was. So should we be Zeiche, that we should be reunited with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe should take us to Yerushalayim and be Golam Mitas Vashlim.
In 1982, Tavshim and Beis, the Rebbe related that as a child, his family would eat carobs on Lag BaOmer in commemoration with what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son would eat in the Maira, in the cave, during the years that they spent hiding from the Romans. The Rebbe also added that it was a very expensive fruit, and carobs were also very rare to find, and so therefore they only had it once a year on Lag BaOmer.
After he was freed from Chile, Rebbe Levi Yitzchok spent the last few months of his life in Alma Ata. At that time, Alma Ata was a hub for many of the Jewish refugees who were fleeing the Russian front. One day, a fight broke out between some of the various groups. This argument pained Rebbe Levi Yitzchok greatly. He said, "When there is famine, you don't look to see whether the bread is white or black, as long as it is bread. Why, oh why, are people quarreling at this time?"
Today, all we have of Reb Levi Yitzchak's Torah teachings are a total of 5 volumes. In Tafshin Nun, the Rebbe discussed the extensive Torah writings of his father. Until today, the Rebbe said, we do not know what happened to the tens and perhaps hundreds of pages of Chidushei Torah written by my father, which are lying hidden somewhere in Russia. Later that year, the Rebbe said, it is interesting to note that the printed Sfarim of my father include primarily what he wrote while in Galus. We do not have the majority of his writings, comprising thousands of pages, which he wrote while serving as Rav.
During the beginning of his tenure as Rav of Yekaterinslav, his opponents did their best to have him removed from his post, using any and all methods available. One day, a government official came to Reb Levi Yitzchak's house to interrogate him about a certain accusation that had been brought against him. His opponents claimed that they had seen him drink whiskey and dance with a shoemaker. The informers protested it's beneath the dignity of such an important city to have its Rav a drunken person who dances with lowly craftsmen. The Rebbe once related this story, and he added that there was some truth to this accusation. The shoemaker was a chassid who had a broad knowledge of chassidus. At a farbrengen of Yutas Kislev or Purim, they had said l'chaim together and began to dance. And so it came to be that the Rav danced with a shoemaker.
Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was invited by the Jewish community of Yafo to serve as its rabbi.
In her memoirs, Rebbetzin Chana writes that when the NKVD came to arrest her husband, they confiscated many of the documents they found in the house. Amongst these documents was a letter from the city of Yafo inviting Reb Levi Yitzchok to serve as their chief rabbi, along with exit visas for the royal family.
Some of Reb Levi Yitzchok's explanations can be found in other Svarim, such as Eira Chama from Amaram Azulai and Yal Oid from Samech Tzedek, but he does not refer to them. The Rebbe explained that his father did not have access to these Svarim, yet he arrived at the same conclusions as they did without seeing what they wrote.
Shluchim, Anash, Tmimim, everyone have seen that in the last few years, the commemoration of the Yortzeit, the Yom HaYelula of the father of the Rebbe, Reb Levi Yitzchok, reached higher levels. It all started actually years ago when Harav Avram Shem Tov started with the Yarchakala, established the Yarchakala in camp, and that was in honor of the Yortzeit, the Yom HaYelula of Reb Levi Yitzchok. But now it was nispashet, it broadened itself, and people in the last few years have been going to the Tzion of Reb Levi Yitzchok in honor of his Yom HaYelula. But this year, things are different. Eibishter wanted it to be different. Most people are not able to go, only very few. And even those who are able to go went with great hishtadlus, had to work hard to be able to get in. But we know that the Eibishter is magdim lefu lamake. So the Eibishter gave us another opportunity that because of the modern technology, we're able to have something that we were not able to have before. We're able to have a global gathering of Chassidim all over the world in honor of Reb Levi Yitzchok and the day of his Yom HaYelula. And for that, we have to thank the Eibishter. At least we have that we're able to support and show the specialty of the day by getting all together through these forms of technology. What I would like to do is explain the specialty of the day. Specialty of the day is, first and foremost, because it is the Yortzeit Yom HaYelula of the Rebbe's father. The fact that he's the Rebbe's father, our Rebbe's father, is already in and of the greatest chus. And for that he deserves the greatest kavod. We see in Pirkei Avos, Perik Beis, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai describes the milas of his Talmidim. And one of the Talmidim that he described the milah was Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. And he said Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, his milah is Ashrei Yoiladetei, which means lucky is the one that gave birth to him. That itself, the fact that the father and mother gave birth to Rabbi Shua ben Chananya is in itself the greatest milah. And that could fit by the Rebbe also. The fact that the Rebbe, this is the Rebbe's father, gave birth to the Rebbe is the greatest milah. Just like by Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. And the Rebbe has a lot in common with Rabbi Shua ben Chananya because Rabbi Shua ben Chananya was, as referred to by Chazal, of the Gdolei Chachmei Yisrael, from the biggest amongst the Chachamim, amongst the Chazal. And that could apply to the Rebbe also. So when we talk about the Rebbe's father, the fact that he is the Rebbe's father in itself is already the greatest thing, and he deserves the greatest kavod, and therefore it's a big inyan to commemorate it in whichever way possible, and also through going to the Tzion, to his oil. But besides that, the fact that it's the Rebbe's father, he had a chelik in the raising of the Rebbe and the education of the Rebbe. We know in Derech HaTeva, that's the way it is. The parents are the ones that educate the children. And even by great tzaddikim, we find that the parents have a chelik in educating the child, and therefore, whatever that child grows up to be, the parents, the father especially, has a chelik in that growth. And the same thing by the Rebbe. Even though we understand that the Rebbe being Neshama Klolis, and the Rebbe being the Nosi Hador of Deir Ashvi, which is the last door of Golis, and the first door generation of the Gula, as the Rebbe said many times. So being that this is what the Rebbe is, so already from Sheishes Yemei Breishis, from the creation, beginning of the creation, the Rebbe's neshama was destined to be the Rebbe. But nevertheless, in Derech HaTeva, naturally there is a process how this works. So you have to have the parents that educate and raise the child. And therefore they have a chelik in the raising of the child. In Yiddish we say the hodeven of the child. We know the Rebbe once referred to a Lashon and he said that his father hodevet him, which means raised him, educated him. This was once when, by Fabringen, the Rebbe said that there are people who are trying to pressure him to change his mind of certain things that he said. I don't remember if it was Benegeya, his stand on me Yehudi, or Benegeya, his stand on the Shtochim, but they're trying to pressure him, so he said that's not going to work. Nicht of them hat mir der Tate gehodevet, und nicht of them hat mir der Schwer gehodevet. Not my father raised me for such a thing, and not my father-in-law raised me for such a thing. So the Rebbe used the term Yehodevet, because his father had Yehodevet him. And B'meila has a chelik in his growth, and there's a chelik in what the Rebbe became, in Derech HaTeva, in Gashmias. And we know that physically, because we know who was the main teacher, the main person who the Rebbe learned with. So after the Rebbe learned for 4.5 years, from 7 and 11.5, by my grandfather, who was his Malamed, Reb Zalman Vilenkin, Olav Hasholem, and then another year he learned with another person, was Reb Isser Nissen Ribin, and he learned with him, but who did he learn afterwards? Afterwards, he learned with his father only. And his father was the one that taught him, and his father one that learned with him. And his father put in and raised him to be what the Rebbe is. I remember once the Rebbe even said to some people, when their children went on shlichus, and they were standing in Gan Eden Atachten to receive the Rebbe's broche, so the Rebbe at the end turned around to one of the parents and he said, thank you for raising such children. So we could apply it to the Rebbe himself, that this is a person who raised the Rebbe. And we even see it in the Igres, the letters that the Rebbe's father sent to the Rebbe as printed in Lekutei Levi Yitzchak. So there also you see how the Rebbe's father gives him hadracha, shows him, guides him in the way to learn, in Anhoge, in Ruchnius, all kinds of inyonim. Ubemele, besides the fact that this is the Rebbe's father, which in itself is the greatest chus, in Derech HaTeva, he has a chelik in what the Rebbe was. And for that, he deserves the greatest kavod. And for that, he deserves the greatest honor that we should go to his tzion, etc., etc. But I want to mention another nekuda in the mile of going to the tzion of Reb Levi Yitzchak. And that is that I assume, I'm just saying it as an assumption, Mistame, the Rebbe would have wanted to go to the tzion of his father on the day of his Yom Elul, on the day of his Yortzeit. And this is mitzvah, the mitzvah of Kibud Av. So the Rebbe has a mitzvah of Kibud Av, and by Kibud Av there is a din that you have to be mechabed your father b'chayev u'b'meisei while he's alive, and even after his passing you still have a mitzvah of Kibud Av. Actually, I remember that once Pesach night by the Seder, during the meal, the discussion came up when the Rebbe still ate the Sudas in the apartment of the Frierdiker Rebbe, this was Tov Shem Lamed, about whether you should eat with a knife or not. And the Rebbe said that he doesn't eat with a knife because his father didn't. And he used the lotion. Since my father didn't, and since mechabde b'chayu b'meisav, you have to give kavod to your father when he's alive and also after his passing, I still give him kavod by eating the way he did. And the Rebbe gave a reason why he did it, etc., etc. He turned around to the people and said, you should eat with a knife, but I don't because of my father. In other words, the Rebbe stressed that when he does things that gives kavod to his father. So I am sure that the Rebbe would want to go to the tzion of his father on the day of his Yortzeit. We, by going to the tzion of the Rebbe's father, we are doing the Rebbe's mitzvah. We are basically performing the mitzvah that the Rebbe should have performed, so he's performing it to us. We're going on his behalf. So we have a chelik in the Rebbe's mitzvah. Imagine, we are shutfim, we are partners to the Rebbe's mitzvah. That the truth is, we find other things also. The Moshe, when the Rebbe would give out dollars, it was the Rebbe's dollar, and all he did was made you a shliach mitzvah to give his dollar for tzedakah. So it's the Rebbe's tzedakah, but we became partners in the Rebbe's mitzvah. Same thing, bechlal shluchim. Shluchim of the Rebbe do the Rebbe's work. Really, it's the Rebbe who, being Neshama Klolis, would be the one that wants to go out in all cities, in all countries, all over, to meet every Yid and bring him back to Yiddishkeit. But it's not possible, so he makes shluchim, and the shluchim do the mitzvah for him. We become his hands and feet, so to speak. It's like the Frierdiker Rebbe said, B'negei HaKofes, that when we dance with the Sefer Torah, the pshat is like this. The Sefer Torah wants to dance HaSimchas Torah. It doesn't have feet. So we become the feet of the Sefer Torah. So shluchim become the hands and feet of the Rebbe. So here also we are shutfim in the Rebbe's work. But nevertheless, it's not the same, because these are mitzvahs that every Yid has. Every Yid has to give tzedakah, the Rebbe has to give tzedakah, so he's making us partners. Every Yid has to be Mevakar of Yidden. There's a mitzvah, V'hafta l'reacha kamecha. There's a mitzvah, Chayach techich samisecha. So the Rebbe is also mechuyev, and we do it, something that the Rebbe wanted. But we're talking about the mitzvah of kibbutz av of the Rebbe. That's a mitzvah that the Rebbe personally has. We don't have it. It's not our father, it's the Rebbe's father. So it's a personal mitzvah of the Rebbe specifically. And nevertheless, we are the ones that do that mitzvah for the Rebbe. And if we do that mitzvah for the Rebbe, we are shooting the Rebbe's mitzvah. So you could imagine how strong that is. That this brings the real iskashus of the Rebbe, that we are able to unite ourselves with the Rebbe's mitzvah and do the mitzvah for the Rebbe. And therefore, going to the Tzion, and Bechlal doing everything to commemorate the Yortzeit, which is the Rebbe's personal chiyuv al skibadav, and we're doing it, we are part of the fulfillment of the mitzvah of the Rebbe. So you can imagine the connection we get to the Rebbe. But all this that we're saying is all because Rebbe Levi Yitzchok is the father of the Rebbe. But maybe he deserves all this, and we have to do it, and we're mechazek our iskashus to the Rebbe to doing this. But I want to mention also that we have to remember that Rebbe Levi Yitzchok himself was a very, very great special person. A tzaddik, a kodesh, a makubal. So he himself was such a holy person that giving him kavod in itself is something that we are mechuyev to do, that we are doing because of what he himself is, the greatness of what he is. And I want to mention that b'chlal by tzaddikim, their gashmius is a reflection of their ruchnius. So by Rebbe Yitzchok, since his ruchnius beauty was in him, it reflected also itself in the gashmius. Posha begashmius, his hadras ponim was so special. I heard from my mother, Alea Sholem, who was born and raised in Katrinaslav, and would see the Rebbe's father many times. She says, you can't imagine, she told me many, many times, you can't imagine the beauty of the person, the gashmis of his goof. People would walk on the street and would see him, would just stop to gaze at him, to look at him, not even knowing who he was, lahavdil even goyim. And they would move away and make place for him to go ahead. Because the gashmias represented his ruchnias. And his aveda ruchnias, we could imagine the Mesiris Nefesh he had for Yiddishkeit. His Gedusha, we know there are stories told, and one of them is from a responsible, a person that you could trust, a trustworthy person, who said that he was once called to an asifa, to a meeting that took place in a different city, took for a few days, I think, and I think it was the government, they gave him a hotel room. So it came out that for the 3 days he was there, didn't even lay down once on the bed, because he didn't know who else slept on that bed before him. The Rebbe's mother told over that there was a time there was not much water, there was no water. And you can imagine after a while you get thirsty. I imagine the thirst. And when he finally got some water, he didn't drink it, he washed negelwasser with it. Because that's a ruchnas dikinya, rather than to drink the water. So his gedusha is unbelievable, his greatness is unbelievable. We know there's a klal, Bachsidim always was, that the Rabbeim and the Maimorim don't bring, even great tzaddikim svarim don't bring, only special type of svarim are brought down. The Rebbe would bring his father in the Maimorim. Obviously it's from that caliber. Now some will say maybe it's because it's his father. Well, if it's his father, but he's not worthy of being brought in the Maimer, the Rebbe wouldn't bring him. By Rebbe, that's not shayach. So obviously he was worthy. I heard from my Zayde that the Rebbe's father once went into Yechidus to the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab told him, I heard that you give a shir in Tanya, but you give all kinds of biyurim and hesbedim. You know, I wrote the letter, the Rebbe Rashab wrote a letter that people should not give pilpulim and biyurim in Tanya. It's too deep, people should do it. So he says to him, I heard you do it, let me hear some of the things that you say. So he said some of the things, and the Rebbe Rashab said, you could continue. In other words, you get to the depth, you really know what Tanya is. A similar story he also told me, once when the Levi Yitzchak went into Yechidus to the Rebbe Rashav, he asked him, do you give a shir in Chassidus in your city to Balabatim? And he answered, yes. He says, what do you learn? He said, I'm learning the Hemshech Samachvov. He said, oh, Samachvov is this long Hemshech that the Rebbe Rashav himself wrote. He said, where are you holding? He said, we're holding up as the third page, a fourth page, something like that. So he said, how long are you learning already? They said, a few months, he said. A few months it took you to go through the first few pages? So he said, yes. They said, why? He said, because I'm a daik in every word, and I'm a daik why this kasha came before this kasha, and this kasha before this kasha. So the Rebbe Rashab says, I'd like to hear, tell me some of the things you say. So he told him over a few things. So he told him like this. You should know when I wrote this, that's not what I had in mind. I didn't have this in mind, but every word you said is true. That's the type of person he was. My Zayd also told me that he remembers that there was a time when the Russian government wanted to make the Beis HaKvoros, the Jewish cemetery, into a park. They couldn't do anything about it, but at least they piled that the two Rabbonim that were buried there from previous years should be able to be removed and buried someplace else. And one of them was the Chassidish Rov of Katrinaslav that passed away about 25 years before Rabbi Levi Yitzchok came there. His name was Rebbe Wolf, Chassid Tzemach Tzedek. So my Zayda says he was there by that, like funeral, second funeral. And he was watching the Rebbe's father. And when they took out Rebbe Wolf from the grave, he was complete. The body was complete. The people who remembered, the old men who remembered the funeral when he actually was buried, said exactly as he was buried. And my Zayda told me the Rebbe's father and started crying because he really felt these inyonim. That's how a holy person he was. And there are more things that he told me that the Rebbe's father, what he saw in the Rebbe's father. Also the Benegay, what the Rebbe's father told him, Benegay, the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe's father told him that ich hab gute Mebel. In Yiddish, Mebel means furniture, but Mebel is also Mem Beis Lamed, referred to his three sons. The Rebbe, the Mem is the Rebbe's name, Beis is the other son Bedel, and the other son Label. So he said it to him. He also told me a story once. He was there when the Rebbe's father was speaking, giving a whole droshe, and in the middle he came to Yonim and Kabbalah, and he spoke about mikveh, al Kabbalah, and he explained that mikveh is kav ma, and he stopped and he said, I believe no one here understands what I'm talking about, but the one that's there in the back, right at the back of the shul, the Rebbe was standing there, was a kid, says, versteht. But Bechlal B'chol he's such a great person, and that's probably the reason why he was zeicher to be the Rebbe's father. So that itself, he deserved the greatest honor that we could give. And that's why lately it has been a chizuk in making a whole tzimis and a whole tumul and a whole rash when Negeya Chof Ov and going to the Rebbe's father Tzion, and now we're able to even get together, that all of us together could commemorate it all together. But I want to mention that a name of a person who's really responsible for all this, a very, very close friend of mine, a person who's reish v'rishim l'chol dvorim shebekdusha, isha yoker ba'anoshim, a very special person, Reb Avi Sholzon, and his wife, his children, his family, that he's responsible a lot for making this whole tumor and reviving the union of giving kavod to the Rebbe's father, which is automatically a kavod to the Rebbe. And we hope through this we all give kavod to the Rebbe and kavod to the Rebbe's father. Give nachas ruach to the Rebbe and nachas ruach to the Rebbe's father. So I want to wish him that he should be able to be mamshech with his great pulis in this union and all the other good things that he does for a long, long time. Marichas yomim v'shonim tevis. And Hashem should fulfill Mishalis Levavel Teva Miyodei Hamlei Hapsucha Hagdesha Varchova, and Hagdesha, it says in the Baal Shem Tov Siddur, not only with a kuf, but not with a kuf, with a gimel, which Hagdesha Hagdusha means Moli V'Godish Brachas, overflowing brachas for him and for the whole family. And also, since now we're already after Chamisha Asar Ba'ov, so we're able to wish each other Aksiva V'Chasima Teva. The emes is, the Rebbe said that we could start already Chamisha Asar Ba'ov, maybe even before. He even quoted the Munkacher, the Minchas Elazar, who says that Chamisha Asar Ba'ov is begematria ksiva v'chsima tevis. You can start from then. But the way I feel, I remember that really, when did it start? The idea of El started after Chafov. Many of the Fabrengas of Chafov, at the end, the Rebbe said to sing the Nigen Hu Alekenu. So then already we can start wishing Aksiva Chsima Tevis. So we all hope that in schus of Reb Levi Yitzchok, which is, this is his Yom Elula, and therefore today is the special day where it's Tfilas Yom HaSkabel, and automatically the Rebbe, so we should be zeicha to Aksiva Chsima Teva, and the Aksiva Chsima Teva should include, the main thing is that we should see Mashiach, and when Mashiach will come, we'll see each other, we'll all see the Rebbe and all the other tzaddikim and the Rebbe's father, and we should go already in this month of Elul to the Gula Shleima B'Kored Mamish.
It's surely a great honor and a privilege for those that are able to travel to Almata and Chofav. I remember the first time I was still a bocher in yeshiva, and I was traveling then to the Soviet Union, mainly to teach to the local chassidim, to fabring with them, to meet with them, to try to help them. And this idea came up, why not be for Chofav in Almata? So before the trip, I visited Rabbi Nimeitin, who lived then in Crown Heights, and asked him, how will I find the Tzion, the resting place of Reb Leivik? And he gave me clear direction. He said, walk into the Beis HaChaim, go till the end, make a right, go till the end, make a left, and you'll see it. We came there early in the morning, and we started looking for it, and we couldn't find it. Hours and hours and hours. We were going around the Beis HaChaim looking for anything similar to the kever of Reb Leivik, and we couldn't find it. By a huge Ashgacha Protis, right before Shkia, with a group of local Jews, we managed to find the kever. And people didn't even know at that time that Reb Leivik is actually buried in Almata. Local Jews. And they promised that they're going to do whatever they can to visit the place and to understand the schuz that they have. They're in their city, such a big tzaddik is found, and they can go and daven there. I felt then a huge schuz to be able to daven an Chofav by Reb Leivik's holy resting place. Once by Fabringen, the Rebbe said that there's no point of him mentioning when he speaks that this idea or the other idea or something else he learned from his father, because practically everything that he is saying is actually repeating what he heard from his father. No question that the Rebbe's look and how to be Mekarev Eden is something that he saw at home. Everybody knows that Reb Leivik used to arrange Yom Kippur, an early minyan in the morning for the Jews that went to work after davening. So you could imagine what kind of kiruv in those years that Reb Leivik did in Almata. I met once a Jew, he was a big scientist, Mr. Yudin, who told me that when he was a child, he lived in Yekaterinoslav. And sometimes his father used to bring him to the shul where Reb Leivik davened. He said, I didn't understand what his speeches were all about. He just knows he used to stand on the bima and shake his hand, and with moving, powerful words, he used to try to be me'erer Jews to keep Torah mitzvot, notwithstanding all the difficulties. At that time, Toshim Eng S, when I finally found the Tzion, I realized what kind of golus Reb Leivik had during his lifetimes, and probably even more after his lifetime. And Reb Leivik is there still in this golus. The schus of the Eden able to visit him is not only giving a certain kibud avoim, and as we surely understand, it's also connecting with a Yid that gave up everything in order to help other Jews. He went in Golus, he was sent in exile because he was helping other Eden keeping Torah mitzvahs. Why was he arrested? Why did he suffer so much? Not because he wanted to keep Yiddishkeit, because he was spreading this throughout the whole former Soviet Union. He was then considered the leader of Russian Jewry. And that's why he was arrested, and that's why he died in Almata. The same story of Rachel Imeinu, suffering her lifetime and giving herself up for her sister Leah, till Mesirus Nefesh, and later giving up her place in Maras HaMachpelah again for her children, again to help Am Yisrael. So this is again the story of Reb Leivik, through his lifetime and after his lifetime, Mesirus Nefesh to help other Jews. Connecting with such a Yid, with such a tzaddik, and using this special day to ask Hashem to end this golus. No question, the same way the prayers of Rachel Imeinu were listened, the same way we surely will get special brachas with the tefillahs that we'll do on Chofav. So I want to again commend those that were able to arrange that on this special day Eden should be able to travel to Almata. It's a huge schus, and surely this is going to bring major brachas, especially in such a time, the time of Golus, B'seich Golus, Acheshech Echaseoretz, when there's so much darkness. Surely from Almata a lot of light will come out to those that are connected to Reb Leivik, and those that are going to do what he showed us is the right way to bring the Geula Amitis Vashleim.
My father always remember how Reb Levitza was talking hours, and he remembers also the Histalkus, how Rebbe Tzachana says, Odom Godel avemenos to mir verlassen. And what's important is we should learn from, the Rebbe was always talking about the Mesiras Nefesh of Reb Levi Yitzchak, and he passed away before the time. But there is a very strong point that the Rebbe was always talking, that he looked in the whole Shas, he was looking where says the date of Chafar, till we find in Masechta Tainis. Masechta Tainis is talking about a few families that they brought wood for the Beis HaMikdash in a time that you cannot find wood. Because after 15 of Av, the wood was not kosher for the Mizbeach because there was worms. So the mishpache that they gave eitzim in a time that didn't exist to have the eitzim, they made a Yom Tov. And Rebbe explained, when you are giving something that nobody in the world has, and you're giving that to help another Jew that he made a verse, and he needs a kapore but he cannot bring a korban if there is no wood. So this mishpachas has a big schus, but not only they gave it away besimcha. And the Rebbe says that we are giving education to a whole generation that will be ready to give, and to give besimcha, something that nobody has for another Jew. And this is what's going to bring the Geula, the Ahavas Yisrael, the Ahavas Chinam, the opposite of Sinas Chinam that brought the Churban. The Rebbe also said, was very precious by the Rebbe, that to learn the Rebbe Levi Yitzchak Stera, the Rebbe wrote to different Shluchim, one of them, the Talmidim HaShluchim Morocco. My father got also this letter, that it's mine schus, it's my obligation, it's my schus, big schus, to ask everyone to learn from the Torah of my father and to verbring on the day of Chav Av. So it's, if we want to be goyrem nachas ruach to the Rebbe, it's very important to learn the Rebbe's, the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, and the Rebbe says clear that this, the Rebbe Tzachana had Mesiras Nefesh for the Torah of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, because this will be Mezares and will bring the Gula Amitis Vashem.
Interesting that Pesach mentions the response from the Rebbe's father, cut down the Beinach of the Rei Shifti Yisrael Lata, how this message is a message that the Rebbe then took and applied to every Yid. The Rebbe then took this message from his father and went and Ad Hayoim, through Shluchim, through Chassidim, the world is being illuminated with this message of every Yid. If they ever think for a moment, comes the Rebbe and says, L'roi Shifti Yisrael Ata, you have the ability, you, as a famous story with Ramesh Katlarsky about there's no small Jew. Tell the person there's a small Jew in a small island. Every Yid is Roi Shifti Yisrael Ata, and we see it as Mendel mentioned back in the Rebbe, in the Torah Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. There's a word that's actually printed in the first print of Teres Levi Yitzchak, what we say in the Ilah, Ata Noisen Yad La Poishim. So we say the Eibishter gives, Hashem gives a hand for a person to be Chayzer B'tshuva. So Levi Yitzchak touched Ata Noisen Yad La Poishim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives a hand for a person to do the Aveda, and then the Yemin Chapshuti L'Kabel Shovim. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts a person in a situation sometimes, places him in front of a challenge, and then gives him the opportunity to overcome the challenge. So even a person who might be considered in the eyes of some as being far from a righteous Jew, Rabbi Yitzchak was able to see, to rationalize or justify, because it was Me'ez Hashem Hoyse Zois, and Eibishter stands there, right there. There's a story which I recently saw, that there was a Maisa that happened when he first became Rav in Yekaterinoslav. And he was forced, unfortunately, there was a shochet that he found out that was not behaving properly. And his sakin, his chalaf, his knife was not 100%, and he had to remove him from a shchita. And there was a tumult, the elder Rav in town, who were, at the time, there were many non-chassidim, and they made a whole commotion. How could this young Rav come? And they had a din Torah. And at the din Torah, they appointed a witness, and they camouflaged, they staged the witness. They said that he was the person who comes from a higher authority, and he checks a shachtim, and even he says that this sheikh is 100% fine. What they did was they took a person who wasn't that person. He was a mashgiach, and they dyed his beard red because the mashgiach had red beard, and he stood in front of the bezdin, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, who came to the Torah, saw this, and he was at that moment, for the very few moments that he became very upset. And he said, "You are the mashgiach, I know who you are." And suddenly, whoever was present became... Now, what's interesting about the story is that after this incident, when Rabbi Yitzchak was forced to identify the person, and you might say some words that were less than positive about a fellow Yid, for 2 weeks after that, he was in bed, he was sick in bed, Rabbi Yitzchak. From this experience, from having to highlight the negativity of a Yid, it impacted his health. And what's most fascinating is that this Yid, this Sheikhet, later became very close to Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Tzachani writes in the Rishimis, he became close, and he wrote, and he said that all the Yisurim I went through was worth it, that I became close to Rabbi Shnerson. So you see that the Moed de Ka'avis Yisrael, that even though he was forced at a moment to, you might say, belittle a Yid, because in order lahamid HaTorah al Dosa, to establish Torah properly, he did so in a way that, then we have all of the famous story about in one of the darkest times when Rabbi Levi performed a wedding in his apartment, and they needed a tenth to be mashlim the minyan. And upstairs there was a Yid, the famous story. There was a Yid who was
the representative of the KGB was Jewish,
who was an informer, and I believe Yitzchak, to the astonishment of all those who were present, he sent to call him down to be mashlim the minyan.
He'd be the 10th man
to be the 10th person to complete the minyan. And Rabbi Tzachana, of course, writes, and this is recorded actually by a person who knew this person later, that this person, after this incident, he showed up in shul the next morning. When he walked into shul, everyone moved away from him, knowing who he was, the informer that he was. And he said, "Don't worry, you have nothing to fear." And eventually he became someone who became active for the pursuit of Yiddishkeit. So he was transformed as a result of this one experience.
Phenomenal. The Rebbe always wanted the Maisa B'Poil, that the Farbrengen of Chafov should be an impetus to positive action and improvement and growth. And I'd like to ask Rabbi Tal to share with us some of this inspiration in honor of this auspicious day, L'chaim.
You want me to tell everyone what they should do?
What can we learn from the Torah of the Rebbe's father and from the Rebbe's appreciation and expounding on the Torah of his father, and apply it to our lives?
We spoke about the scholarship. We spoke about the Rebbe's father's teachings. It's got to start from the teachings. Everyone, according to their level, and the resources are out there, Baruch Hashem, today, can study a piece of the Torah of the Rebbe's father. And not only can you study it, but you can teach it. Either teach it to a friend, or teach it to your family, to your children, or make a study partner. But the Rebbe wanted that we should mark the day of his father's yahrzeit with learning. And Rabbi Dubov mentioned about the program from the Koil Tfiris Zakenim Lev Yitzchak. The one thing that Rebbe noted was it should be something understood. So on one hand, someone could say, it's such deep Kabbalah, this is material that's challenging even for scholars. And at the same time, we have our work cut out for us. It can be, Pesach said, take it slow, learn it, don't be intimidated, learn it line by line. So it has to start from the Torah, it has to start from learning and digest it, figure it out. And Rabbi Ephraim mentioned the Avas Yisrael, the two go together. They're not two separate things. I mean, learning that of his father's Torah and loving a Jew. So how do the two go together? Learn something and figure out how to give it to somebody else.
And I would highly recommend to learn both the biography of the Rebbe's father, and readily available in English are the diaries of the Rebbe's mother, which are replete in not only information but in feeling. And we were mentioning earlier, we're not sure when the Rebbe was able to read that himself for the first time. I know the Rebbe saw it, and that's certainly a fact. But I believe, just like the Rebbe was concealing bad news from his mother was certainly concealing the hardship that was experienced, and even when she was here, certain things. But it's in her diary, and those have been published. It's not yet in a book. I know it's being prepared, but it's readily available in English and other languages online. And we should certainly learn from the lives of these great tzaddikim who mean so much in our own lives, and be reunited with them with the coming of Mashiach.
Amen. Just to mention, you mentioned how the sensitivity with which the Rebbetzin Chana shared or withheld information, not to cause any unnecessary aggravation to the Rebbe, not being able to be there for his father in his most difficult times. So I recently heard that, first of all, the Rishonos were not sure. I asked Rav Pesach and Rav David when and if. So you said that apparently the Rebbe did see it, but we know that the Rebbe, actually Rebbe Tzimchana, gave most of her diaries to her niece Zelda. I'm not sure how the amount of times the Rebbe did see it, but it's interesting that apparently the Rebbe, as much as we know that the Rebbe withheld information from his mother to avoid any unnecessary aggravation and feelings of discomfort regarding his brother, etc., the passing of his brother. Interestingly, the same is true for Rebbe Tzimchana withholding information about the difficult times of Rebbe Levi Yitzchak during his imprisonment. I recently heard a story that Rabbi Aryeh Leib Kaplan, who's the Zayda of Rabbi Nachum and Rabbi Shmuel Kaplan, he was a Rav, a Litvish Rav, not far from Yekaterinoslavl. He had met Rebbe's father during a number of Asifas HaRabbanim. And the night that Rabbi Leivik was arrested, he was arrested as well. And he was placed, they didn't keep the Yidden together, he was placed in a village nearby.
This was when they were exiled.
Exiled, yeah.
And a village earlier. Very phenomenal story.
Yeah. So they, interestingly, his children, Rabbi Aryeh Leib's children, Rabbi Shagim Melech Kaplan and Rabbi Moshe Binyamin Kaplan, Rabbi Shagim Melech actually learned in Yekaterinoslavl in Lubavitch, in Yekaterinoslavl. So they knew, had a shachs with Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, and they would bring packages and food to their father, who was exiled, knowing that Rabbi Yitzchak was not far.
And it was self-sacrifice. It was a great peril to their own lives, because what they did back then, the exile was a phenomenal punitive way that the Russians came up with. They said, send them away, and you couldn't leave that city. And if someone found you, and you had to have a paper, like a passport, that said where you belong. If you were out of that city, there was one punishment. And that was, like the Rebbe said, the opposite of life. So, and they nevertheless brought him food in the next village over, because they knew already that he until this, before the Rebbe joined him, and he had to fend for himself, and this is what he was cut out for the Torah more than for finding food during the starvation.
So they would bring him, there also bring him food packages at least once a week, or sometimes more. Finally, when Rebbe Tzimchana was finally able to join Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, so she came, it was Erev Shabbos. She came into the room worried about his physical state, his health, his matzav. He wasn't one that was able to prepare his own meals necessarily, as we know. And she comes in, and Rebbe Tzimchana sees that a kugel is sitting on the table. So she asked her husband, Rebbe Yitzchak, where's this from? So Rebbe Yitzchak, in a unique moment, said, this came from Eliyahu Hanavi. The following week, the Kaplan boys, Rebbe Shagim Melech and Rebbe Moshe Binyamin Kaplan, returned. And they once again came to bring their food, not knowing that Rebbe Tzimchana had arrived. And as they were making their way to the small room of Rebbe Leivik turned to Rebbe Tzimchana and said, "Ot kumt Eliyahu Hanavi." Here comes Eliyahu Hanavi. Now, interesting, they did not know the story until years later in Tafshin Vav, when they were in Pucking. that's when Rabbi Tzimchanu, who lived next to the Kaplan family, repeated the story. Okay, so what we see here, that what I found out recently was that the Kaplan family assumed that the Rebbe was aware of the help that they provided his father, and there was a time, actually many years later, in Tafshin Lamed Beis, in 1972, when the Kaplan family needed a certain bracha for a certain Yeshua, and Rabbi Shimon Yom Kaplan decided that he's gonna cash in, he's gonna call in his trips and ask for a bracha, and he mentioned the schusim that the family had, that they were there for the Rebbe's father. And as he was mentioning this to the Rebbe, it became very clear that the Rebbe never knew, the Rebbe never heard from his mother
how bad it was, and the Rebbe was never even told that the Kaplan family did what they did. And it became very obvious that Rebbe Tzimchana avoided sharing anything that may have caused Agbas Nefesh to the Rebbe. The Rebbe gave brachas, the Rebbe spoke at the time about, but we see the enormous sensitivity, obviously Yisrael, both between the Rebbe and the Rebbe and Rebbe Tzimchana, but in general, towards any fellow Yid. Chaim.
Zevi Tzadikim Demim Lebeiram, Malachas Kame Vekame Rabbonim, seine sie sich nicht, was es mit der Kild Momo Dako, und bei sie ist das Arash Godel, und Ruach Gdele, und Farekis Horim, Bechule. Also mir seine sich Balabatim, nicht Rabbonim, ich machen den Emerson Rash.
Nigun shel Reb Levi. A Koffenigen. Hey, dum bum boy, hi hi ram, did I la la, did I la did I, da did I. I am bum bum bye. Hey, bum 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 boy, did I la 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 la. Haya cheyvelo sif seichem bihilo im dai 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 ha cheyvelo sif seichem bihilo im dai 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 vari ke silo khmbrocho atli dai hoy atli dai 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 vari ke silo khmbrocho atli dai atli dai die, 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 die. Die, die, die. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, ay, didn't buy. Ay, 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 hey, mosai, kosima, el yafutzo, man zach khutzo. Ay, 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 mosai, kosima, el yafutzo, man zach khutzo. Mosai, 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 kosima, el yafutzo. Hey, mosai, 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 kosima, el yafutzo. Yeah. Yafutzu, he mosai, 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 kosiman. Hai luchishe yafutzu. Ksivo b'chasim toivo, lishon toivo misuko. Ksivo b'chasim toivo, lishana tova umetuka. Ay, taray. Yo ba 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 la di 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 da. Kisivo b'chasim toivo, lishono toivo misuko. Kisivo b'chasim toivo, lishono toivo shna shel giulo. L'chaim, l'chaim. Yasher koach, שנזכה לגאולה שלמה. יעברם ברים במים ביפביביבם, יעברם בררררם, דרירירם, דיירררררררררררם, היררררררררם, דיירררררררם. לשנה טובה, שנה גאולה, אומר